Hey, welcome everyone to the March 2023 Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Hillary Barner, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Shirley Paulson. Her guest scholar this evening is Dr. Christine Shea. Tonight, our textual study is titled, What Did Jesus' Disciples Do After He Was Gone? Many people have wondered about this, but they don't know where to look outside the Bible, and the Bible doesn't say much about them. We'll take a look at 3 extra-canonical writings that ought to give us a good start on the question. Before we turn it over to Shirley, I want to remind you how much we encourage and appreciate your ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. To create podcasts, blog posts, and Zoom discussions every month, we actually need financial support. That's why your monthly donations on Patreon are especially helpful. Also, one-time payments on PayPal or by check are certainly appreciated. Thank you so much. Now, Shirley, you can take it from here.
Okie doke. Thank you, Hillary. Appreciate that. So I have to say, I hear this question a lot, the one about what did the disciples do after Jesus was gone? And so wouldn't we love to know? I suppose that's why you're here tonight. And we'll get into that, but we may not also answer all the questions you may have about it. Just want you to be kind of forewarned about that. So what scholars do is to pick up all the scraps of information that they can find and piece it together in ways that help us think about it. It's kind of like looking out at the universe with binoculars. You know, you can see a little bit better with a naked eye, but it doesn't tell you as much as you'd like to know. So tonight I've asked Dr. Christine Shea to join us again. She was here with us a couple months ago. She's a scholar of antiquity, and I thought she could give us a feel for how scholars go about finding history in antiquity and what we do about that. And then after we talk to Chris a little bit, we'll take a look at these 3 less familiar texts that Hillary mentioned to you, just to see if they can help us understand a little bit more about what happened to the disciples after Jesus. All right, Chris, what are you going to do about this? Your turn.
All right. Okay. First of all, let me say I'm a classics professor, so be gentle, all right, and forgive me if I tell you things that you already know. We might start by talking about sort of the layering of the tradition, which would apply not only to sources from early Christianity, but ancient sources in general. We generally say for sources in ancient Christianity that the first layer of the tradition would be Jesus saying stuff. Do we know many things that Jesus said for certain? No. There would be scholars who would agree that some of the parables, perhaps, or some of the sayings might be from Jesus. They might agree, but it would be very few. In some ways, if you wanted to know how few they are or what the consensus would be of some scholars, you might want to consult the 5 Gospels, which is a publication of the Jesus Seminar, which is a red letter edition, so that you can see in red where what passages the scholars voted on. You're not seeing much red here because there isn't much red. As being authentically from Jesus. So that would be a first layer of the tradition. A second layer of the tradition, we could say, would be the apostles talking about what Jesus said about the kingdom. And from that layer, we also don't have very much. It doesn't matter that people have ascribed gospels to the apostles. People were interested in ascribing gospels to the apostles because that gave them more panache. It gave them more currency. It looked better to associate your group and your group's writing with the apostles. Okay. The next layer of the tradition would be communities talking about the apostles, talking about what Jesus said about the kingdom, and they were removed again as Christianity develops. And then the last layer we often say is communities talking about communities, talking about the apostles, talking about what Jesus said about the kingdom. And when we're there, we're pretty far away, perhaps, from what Jesus or the apostles might have said about anything. Though that's where many of the documents that we have from the Nag Hammadi discovery, for example, in 1945, belong to that layer of the tradition. In other words, they're pretty far removed, we think, from the earliest layers. Of course, people would argue about what the earliest layers of Christianity are, but we can certainly say that we have no copies of any Christian documents from before about 200 AD, except, of course, for P52, which is a bit of the Gospel of John. But when the excavator found that, the excavator said that that was from a layer that dated from 125 to 275, and it's always dated to 125. Because there's some interest in finding that to be the earliest piece that we have, even though it's just a little snatch. So the other thing, of course, that happens in antiquity is that there are copies of copies of copies. It's not the printing press, as you know, and so mistakes are made. As people lose the languages or languages that they didn't particularly have very well, for example, make mistakes, just as little kids do when they say the Pledge of Allegiance. You know, they say, "I led the pigeons to the flag of the United States of America." Okay, one nation, invisible, because they don't know the word indivisible, etc. And most of the manuscripts we have from antiquity have those kinds of errors in them, perpetuated. So in that sense, we really can't say that we have autograph copies of anything, original copies of anything anybody said. And the later Christian communities are interested sometimes in arguing with other Christian communities. So, for example, once you decide that Jesus is the Son of Jehovah, Christian communities that want Jesus to be the Son of God don't like it when Gospels call Joseph the father of Jesus, or when texts call Joseph the father of Jesus. And so their texts just erase that. And so those kinds of things are indications that later communities are interested in sort of making the documents that they have say the things that they can believe in. So these are not things that would happen necessarily in our world, or if they did, it would be easy to spot them with the printing press, or you'd say, "Oh no, that's a fake photograph. It's not real," or whatever, or something like that. And we have some evidence that the ancients think that. So, for example, we have the case of the Acts of Thecla. You may know the Acts of Paul and Thecla. The Acts of Paul is one of the Acts groups of writings that talk about what the first generation of Jesus believers did, Paul. And in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Thecla is a very liberated female who regularly disobeys the laws of God and man, about the controlling the behavior of females. And later Christian communities didn't like that. So Tertullian reports that they found the forger who wrote the document and took him to court, and he confessed that he wrote the documents of forgery. And that when he was asked why he wrote it, he said, which was probably true enough of the authors of all the documents we have, "I liked Paul and wanted to write something about him." And in some ways, we could call that the an authorial statement for all the things we have from early Christianity. I liked Jesus and I wanted to write something about him. I liked Andrew. I wanted to write something about him. I liked Thecla. I wanted to write something about her. Of course, we could say the same about documents on the pagan side as well. So, for example, you may not know that we have 13 letters from Roman antiquity that are supposed to be by Plato. Did Plato write them? Please, they're in Koine Greek of the Roman Empire. All right. They're in a language Plato didn't speak in some ways. Okay. So how did they come to exist? Somebody liked Plato and wanted to write something about him. Of course, in the case of the letters of Plato or other things like that, sometimes what it is students who want to comment philosophically on the thought of a philosopher, and they think that a dissertation like mine, or probably not yours, Shirley, would be too boring a way to do that. And so they comment on the philosophical thought of Plato by writing what appears to be a letter from Plato. Quite common. We have letters that are supposed to be from Plato. We have letters that are supposed to be from Pythagoras. We have letters that are supposed to be from Epicurus, etc. Okay, and each of those authors would have said, I liked him and I wanted to write something about him. Okay, so that's the kind of milieu that we're in. And do the ancients understand their world? We could say they probably do. They probably understand that they're not living according to the same rules of history as we live according to, where you could prove every minute of public life of President Biden because it'd be on film, every minute he spent in public. And probably a good number of minutes he might have spent in private are on film. And you could prove everything that happened. But the ancients know that they don't know that stuff. And in some ways, we can say that the canonical Gospels even admit to that. Remember that Mark, Luke, and Matthew are not identical. They have differences. And John is from the moon compared to them. And so, but the ancients put those four things together anyway, whereas we certainly wouldn't have put some book on World War II alongside the Hitler Diaries forgery. Remember the Hitler Diaries forgery? Some guy in 1983 who forged Hitler's diaries. Okay, we wouldn't put those things together. They'd be too different or whatever. But the ancients don't have any problem with that. So even the canonical Gospels show grave differences. They know that there are differences. Okay, so what would be some of the differences? Well, one of the differences would be when we're talking about what the disciples did after Jesus, let's ask this question. Which disciples would those be? You got a list? Because there is no list. Okay, you have the three synoptic gospels have a list, and the list is pretty close, but there are some differences. Is Nathaniel, Bartholomew, for example, who knows? There are four James, one of whom is Jesus's brother. Which one would that be? Okay, there are five Philips. Okay, it's hard to keep track of all the Marys. Then you have the list, such as it is from the Gospel of John, which is partial. I'll say. Then you have the list from the Acts of the Apostles that throws in somebody like Barnabas. Was he a disciple? So when we first start this discussion, we're hard up against the fact that we haven't really got a list of disciples at all anyway, much less trying to figure out what they did after Jesus. Several of the people on the list are quite interesting, of course, and those would be Jesus's brothers. So you had a presentation on the Gospel of Thomas. Was that Bob Miller? Did Bob Miller talk, Shirley?
No, I don't remember.
Some books.
Yeah.
Some books that you might Lost Scriptures here. And this is Bart Ehrman's book and the Complete Gospels.
Right.
It's Colbridge Press.
Yeah.
I will give you this kind of information.
Right.
In any case, Thomas, called Didymus Judas Thomas, was Jesus' twin brother. Oh, yes. His identical twin brother. Did you know Jesus had an identical twin brother? Okay. In early Christianity, people thought Jesus had an identical twin brother. How do we know he was an identical twin? Because in the Acts of Thomas, which was an Acts that we found, like the Acts of the Apostles, same kind of thing. Thomas is, Jesus is dead. Jesus appears to Thomas and tells Thomas that he wants Thomas to go to India to spread the news of the kingdom. And Thomas doesn't want to go. And Jesus then takes human form again and goes to a merchant who is from India and tells him that he ought to bring with him Thomas, who is a carpenter and will be useful in building. And the merchant seeks out Thomas where Jesus said, and he says to Thomas, "Oh, I see that you're identical to the guy who came to talk to me. So you must be the guy I'm looking for." So Thomas and Jesus are apparently identical twins. And Thomas goes off with him and takes the gospel to India. And then the story goes, dies in India. How does he die? Okay. In the stories, all of the disciples are martyred except John of Patmos, who lives to write the book of Revelation and dies about 100 CE of old age. But that's compiling all the tales together. And of course, it's not as if there's any real evidence of any of them being martyred. The Gospels only mention one dying. That's in Acts 12. Only mention the death of one disciple. In the canonical Acts, the Acts that are in the New Testament, only mention the death of one disciple. And that's in Acts 12. The other stories of the deaths of the disciples are all in documents that were regarded as invalid, apparently, by the early church. If that's what that pile we found next to that corpse of the monk in Nag Hammadi, if the fact that they were in that jar means that they were condemned. Whatever. Peter, you know, the well-known tale of Peter being crucified upside down is from the Acts of Peter. You may have seen it in the movie Quo Vadis, for example, from 1951, which is based on the Acts of Peter, not on anything that's in the New Testament of the death of Peter or anything like that. Of course, Quo Vadis, the movie, makes what they take out of the Acts of Peter look reasonable. That Peter came to Rome, remember? He's leaving Rome and he has a vision of Jesus. Jesus says, "Quo Vadis, where are you going? My people need you." And he turns around and goes back to Rome, where he is put in the arena and crucified upside down. Okay. He stands up in the arena, arrested, crucified upside down. What the movie doesn't show is other episodes in the Acts of Peter, which are less likely. For example, the episode where Peter has a duel with Simon Magus, the magician, in the arena in front of the entire Roman Senate. And he brings a man back to life in the arena. in front of the entire Roman Senate, as if the entire Roman Senate were interested in the deeds of early Christians. So that's the kind of tale that makes its way into Christianity. But in fact, most of these tales can't be supported by any external evidence. What would we like for external evidence? Well, what we'd like is the Romans, who don't have a dog in the hunt, writing a note that says, "Oh, we had to crucify a guy upside down today. I thought, this guy must be nuts. Why does he want to be crucified upside down?" See, that'd be nice if we had that, but we don't. What we have is people who, I liked Peter, and I wanted to write something about him. And so I wrote the Acts of Peter. And in some ways, in early Christianity, that may have been regarded as an act of grace. That may have made you someone who was popular in your Christian community, that you wrote the Acts of Peter. And we have to remember that that may be the source of most of the things that we have from antiquity. Not just the pagan things, but some of the classical things too. The early Christians, for example, seem to feel bad that the Romans don't seem to take notice of people that are so important to them, like Jesus and Paul. And so we have a set of letters that's supposed to be from Seneca, the big Roman philosopher and tutor of Nero, to Paul. They're supposed to have exchanged letters. And that's the kind of thing that may have happened in later Christianity. When you thought back about the past, said, well, somebody was as smart as Paul. Seneca would have been interested to meet him, probably. And so you have that projected back and bringing the two of them together. Do we classicists count those as real letters of Seneca? No. Should they be counted as real letters of Paul? You know they're not. Are they in the New Testament as letters of Paul? No. So, but anyway, those are the kinds of things that happen. And so that can make it hard to put together an account of what happens to the apostles, except that by collecting all the tales together, they all were martyred except John. Whoever they were all martyred except John. Anyway.
Oh, Chris. All right. Now, thank you so much for helping us to just get our minds wrapped around this history of antiquity. You're right. We've grown up with being taught this is what happened, this is what happened. And so when we try to dig into what else happened, we run into, why doesn't anybody tell us what else happened? It must have been important. And so why don't we know that? So that's why I wanted you to come and talk to us about this. And so before this night is over, I want to give the rest of you some hope that there's a reason to read these things. So there's something good about them. But the main thing that I wanted Chris to tell you is that we're not looking to any of these things for history. We're looking for them for something else. So let's just open it up a little bit and have people ask you some questions or have a little conversation before we get into the actual text I wanted to talk about. Sarah's ready to go. So Sarah, go ahead. There you go.
Is there any generic difference between the Acts of so-and-so and the Gospel of so-and-so or according to so-and-so? Are those two really distinct genres?
Yeah, I would say so. Some of what's happening, I believe, and many of us believe, in early Christianity is that the Christians are interested in creating their own books that resemble the kinds of books that already exist in pagan literature. Okay. And so in some ways, Acts is epic. It's the Iliad, the Odyssey. You may have heard, you may know Dennis MacDonald's work, etc. Just not poetry. Or romance. You could think of them as being ancient romance. And that's a particular kind of writing. Whereas the Gospels are something else. In in some ways that the canonical Acts and the Gospel of Luke go together. It might be that it's an imitation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. In other words, the one is the Iliad and the other is the Odyssey, which travel together, and acts as the Odyssey in some ways. And the Gospel is imitating the Iliad in the sense of it being a conflict, and it's in one place in a city that's going to be destroyed, that is Jerusalem, etc. But I won't press that. But yeah, the Gospel is a particular kind of story. It's a magic man story, like the biography of Simon Magus, or it's the Alexander romance, Alexander the Great, etc., that sort of thing. Of course, the original form of the Gospel, as you know from an earlier time when somebody's spoken on the Gospel of Thomas, many people believe the original form of the Gospel was a sayings Gospel. This is what Jesus said, this is what Jesus said, this is what Jesus said. Okay. So you could also argue that the original form of the Gospel was something like the sayings of the Spartan kings, which Plutarch saves. So Plutarch, in the early Roman Empire, has sayings of the Spartan kings. Spartan king so-and-so said this, Spartan king so-and-so said this, said this, said this. One of those sayings, by the way, is, it's not the well who need a doctor, but the sick, which sounds like a Jesus saying. Okay.
Yeah.
So depending upon what you want to think a gospel is, some of them are that. Okay. And some of them have a tale attached to them, a story, like a biography.
Here I am. My question is, how, and this is not historical, so I understand if you don't want to answer it, how do you interact with people who read the Bible literally?
Well,
And say this has to be true because it says this here. How do you interact in a context like that?
Well, you know, sometimes it's impossible to have a discussion with someone.
Yes.
I mean, in the sciences, you would say there are people who believe in the Big Bang theory for the creation of the universe, and there are people who believe in the steady state theory. The universe has always been the same. There isn't much room for discussion there.
Mm.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Sometimes you just agree to disagree.
Sometimes you just agree to disagree. I often say that I think that faith is a gift. Perhaps it's a gene, maybe, or something, and I don't have it, and some people do. That seems to make them happy, and for that reason, I'm glad to have it. I wish I had it, but I don't. So.
That's a very interesting response.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Anyway, I have a quick question for you. Do we know if any of these writers were female? Were there any educated women in the antiquities?
Of course, you have famous women writers. You have Sappho, you have Hypatia, for example, from the early period. You have Corinna, the Roman poetess. And it's not as if women could not read and write. It's not that reading and writing is so damn hard that you couldn't, God knows I would have been forcing my brothers to teach me if they wouldn't let me learn. But in any case, so the problem would be, can women claim to be the authors? And that's another issue. Would a work be copied? Would it be put in libraries? Would it be preserved if it had a woman's name attached to it? And that's not so easy.
Right.
Okay. Are there famous cases where people have argued that women are authors and they just haven't got their name on there? Yes. Well, Samuel Butler, for example, argued that the Odyssey was written by a woman because the Odyssey has so much interest in things like Helen of Troy's sewing basket and so little knowledge of how to rig a ship that he argued that. But of course, we know that the Odyssey was many, many voices, and it wasn't written, it was an oral work. But some of them may have been women's voices, but not in public performance. But anyway, so it would be hard to say whether there were women who wrote, but I suppose there's no reason not to think that, considering that the vast amount of writing we have, that some of it wasn't written by somebody's sister under his name or something like that. So
That's a fun question, Richard. Thank you. And Honor,
Thank
go
you.
ahead. I see your hand there.
Early on, Chris was, when she was citing all those extra canonical things and the people in them, and saying that they probably didn't say what they said, they probably didn't even exist. But then she would say, it's not in the Bible. It's not in the Gospels that we have in the Bible. Are you saying that there's some reliability in the Gospels that we have in the Bible? Or are we simply stuck with these people we read about existed and that's all we really can know?
okay. Well, the reason that I appeal to the Gospels is because they underwent, the ones we have, underwent, even the ancients thought there was something. Even the ancients made some kind of sorting. That's really why I separate the two. But of course, the canon of the New Testament and the formation of the canon is an interesting problem anyway. The Council of Nicaea seems to favor narrative gospels, for example. So gospels that don't have narrative bits probably were rejected for that reason alone. But the ancients do claim that some things are more valuable than others. They do accuse some people of being forgers, for example. But that often suits their own purposes. The great heresiologists like Tertullian or Epiphanius or Irenaeus condemn a lot of groups and their gospels, their written works. You know about the secret gospel of Mark, for example, that business.
We haven't talked about that one. We will, but that we haven't even gotten there yet. That'll be
Yeah.
another whole
Okay,
thing, I
but
think.
anyway, yeah. So,
Yeah. All right. So I want to get into these other texts that I promised we would talk about tonight. So the
Pardon me, Shirley, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'd just like to ask Chris one more thing.
Okay, sure.
I would gather from what she has said that from her research, there's a very short list, even out of the canonical Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. There's a very short list of things that were actual. Would you be willing to comment on that?
That's what she did. Right.
Okay. Well, some of the question, of course, is what do you mean by actual? In other words, do they reflect the practices and beliefs of a particular Christian community at a particular time? And do they reflect them accurately? Whether the details of the story are true or not. And the answer to that often is yes. Okay. Does Gone with the Wind have some truth about it, for all that it's a fictional work, is accepted as fictional, is and was written much later by someone who didn't live through it? But does it have some kind of truth about it? Yeah, it does.
Mhm.
Can you find it? Can you find out some truth about the Georgian community during the Civil War? Yeah, you can. So that's the kind of truth we would have, rather than the truth of whether Scarlett O'Hara existed or.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
And that's actually a great segue into these other texts, because I think that's what our point is, that as we look at these other texts, there's a reason to look at them. I mean, you are not going to find history, but you're going to find out why people thought these ideas were important. So the reason for my selecting the Gospel of Judas and the Acts of John and the letter of Peter to Philip is that all three of them share very thoughtful ideas about what the disciples might have been doing or thinking about. And I think Chris has made it really clear to us that we're not looking to these for history. We're looking to them for the ideas. So Judas is an interesting one. You know, the Gospel of Judas was only discovered in 2006. I mean, think about that. The modern world hasn't known that until recently. And it's a startling book. If you're not familiar with it, it basically says that Judas was favored above all the other disciples because he understood Jesus better than anybody else. I doubt that most of you were taught that. It doesn't come across that way in the canonical Gospels. So why would anybody pay any attention to this? Well, I think that's what's interesting about this, because when we look at the Gospel of Judas, we get a different picture of Judas. For one thing, the story about Judas killing himself only occurs in one text that I know of anyway, in Matthew, where he kills himself. But in Luke, is it Luke? Which one is it? John, I think. No, I'm sorry. The Acts of the Apostles tells us that he didn't commit suicide. He actually went out and didn't repent. He went and bought the field and then fell, and all his guts fell out and all that kind of stuff. And those are the only two stories about Judas. But this other one, which was written by who knows who, says that no, Judas was doing something really important. And this kind of goes into the point that Chris was making about Jesus having a twin brother. Because in these different stories about the disciples, they all have something special about their relationship with Jesus. And the special thing that Judas has is that in this gospel writer was saying that Judas understood Jesus in a way that others didn't get it. In fact, he's kind of angry at the other disciples, saying, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand Jesus at all. I understand him the best. And the way Judas understood Jesus was that Judas thought of that sacrifice was a wrong way to understand. That, in fact, the whole Jewish tradition about sacrifice was not the way God took care of God's people. In fact, the whole idea was that Jesus was showing us that there was a life that was more important and beyond what you could see according to your physical senses, that there's something else more important going on. And so Judas was more interested in Jesus and his immortal life. And that it didn't come about through killing him or making a sacrifice for us to get to know God better. So that's something worth thinking about. I think I'm just trying to look at the time what we have. What I think I'll do is I'm going to give you an overview of these three texts, and then we can go back and look maybe a little more carefully at all of them. So that's the basic story of Judas. I think he would have argued that he agreed with the prophet who said to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with my God, that's better than sacrifice. So that was Judas's argument. All right, now the second one I wanted to talk about is the letter of Peter to Philip. This is one of the three that's in the Nag Hammadi collection. And so I hope you know by now that the books in the Nag Hammadi were not all the same. They're quite different, but this is a unique story about the disciples in general. Specifically, Peter and Philip are named, and so is, I guess just Peter and Philip are named in this, but they talk as if they're all together. And the story here, again, this was written much later, as Chris, I think, has really helped us understand tonight. These were stories that were written later. I like the way you said, because they liked Peter, they liked Philip, they wrote these stories. And this story was written to help comfort people, the Jews who had lost everything. This was after the next war with Rome. They'd already lost the temple. And so they're devastated. And so for them to figure out what to do next, this particular story is written imagining what it might have been like for the disciples to understand Jesus' guidance when he wasn't with them anymore, as was the case now a century later. So the story was that after Jesus was crucified, this is the story in the letter of Peter to Philip. After Jesus was crucified, then the disciples were all terrified that they were going to be killed for good reason. I mean, it was a terrifying thing that the people were being crucified everywhere. So they get together and they're praying. And in their praying, a voice comes to them. And they recognize it as Jesus because Jesus says, I'm the one who's always with you. I was always with you. Why don't you remember that I'm with you? So they listen to this voice who guides them. And the whole book is about the guidance for them, what to do without Jesus, trying to remember what Jesus would have said, how Jesus could have helped them in a devastating time. So it's a valuable book because they're imagining, remembering how Jesus could be helpful even when Jesus wasn't there to tell them what to do. Interestingly, I think this is a story about the disciples that's quite different from the traditional view that says the disciples became, great, important, pompous leaders. They were huddled together and scared, and they are guided by this voice, and they've become agents. They have the voice then from Jesus to go out and to help other people and become light bearers. And that was the message of this particular text, that Jesus had come to earth bearing light, and that his message wasn't gone, that the disciples should take up this light and become light bearers also. And they were instructed to go back to Jerusalem in the middle of all these terrifying things going on, to go back to the temple in Jerusalem and to heal. And that's what they did. So the text says that they healed a crowd. I think that's kind of a wonderful guidance there, to think of what to do when you're scared, to come together, to find your purpose, to carry on the light and go out and help other people the best you can. So that was the message for this particular text. Now, did that happen to Peter and Philip? Probably not, because we know that this was like 3 generations after they lived. And there's, as Chris has pointed out to us, there's no historical evidence that they ever had this happen to them. But it's a story that gives us a little flavor of trying to understand what Peter and Philip might have been thinking about, might have been doing, what it might have been like for a disciple to come to terms with the fact that Jesus was gone. All right, the third one, the Acts of John. Chris has already alluded to the Acts. And of course, we have in the canonical Bible, we have the Acts of the Apostles, but there are many other Acts. Acts of each of the disciples, well, 5 of them are major ones anyway. In the Acts of John, I just wanted to bring that out as an example of these books that are called Acts. Interestingly, this one was not lost like the Gospel of Judas that was only found in 2006. The letter of Peter was found in 1945, and the Acts of John never got lost. It's been housed, I believe, in the Vatican. And I understand that the Vatican or the Catholics don't particularly care about advertising these acts because they sound kind of odd. They are peculiar. If you were to read the Acts of the Apostles without thinking it was in the Bible, you might also think that it's a little weird too, because it tells some very strange stories about how, this couple came to pay their taxes, or they were supposed to be contributing their wealth to the community. They didn't do so. And so they were brought in to talk to the disciples. And so I forget which one dies first. Either he dies or she dies. But anyway, they come in one at a time. They fall over dead because they hadn't been contributing to the community. That's a little weird. But we read that because it's been in the Bible. We read that as a story of saying, okay, you should contribute to the community. And you kind of leave it at that. But these other books sound a lot like that. And you can read into them some kind of meaning. Whether that actually happened, probably not, but there's meaning to it. So the Acts of John might be a good source for understanding John, because again, we know some things because there are several different texts that talk about John, where he went. He might have gone to Ephesus because there's a lot of evidence that he did. Again, whether he did or not, we don't really know, but there's some other kind of evidence that he might have gone to Ephesus. So anyway, this is a story again about what happened to John after Jesus was gone. It's a very long and complicated story. What makes it even more complicated is the fact that there are a bunch of different manuscripts that don't fit together. So you have one part of the story that goes this way, another part of the story that goes that way, but they're all part of the Acts of John and they don't really fit together very well. But we do have some stories in there that are quite interesting to think about. So John is following Jesus after fishing with his brother James. And like Jesus, he's talking, let's see. Oh, I know what I was going to say about that. What I wanted to explain about why this is a difficult book is the fact that this is considered a romance novel, which was, we brought up the question before about what kind of genre this is. And the acts are, the genre of them is considered to be like a romance novel, where they have very similar threads through them, where the disciple goes off to some foreign place where they were called to go. That was their assignment after they had dispersed from Jerusalem. And then they go to these faraway places. They have many miracles of healing, and to the point where you begin to wonder if these could possibly have anything to do with something real. But on the other hand, did they? Didn't they? We don't know. But then they also end up drawing a lot of attention to them. People get upset with them, and then they're martyred, which is Chris's point, was that they were all martyred. And these stories are usually told in the romance novels because they all end up kind of the same way. One of the stories, John and his disciples are approaching Ephesus, and they meet up with Lycomedes. Is that how you say it, Chris? Lycomedes, however you say it, that'll do. Okay. Anyway, so he falls down before John, kind of the way Jairus fell down before Jesus when Jairus was asking for help to come help his daughter. So Lycomedes falls down before John because he says he's had a vision that John can come and help. And he begs John to come and help because his wife is in a state beyond hope. So John agrees, and when they arrive at the house, he sees his lifeless wife and cries out and faints from despair. Now, he could have died. I think the story tells us that he died, but then again, maybe not, because he gets raised. Jesus raises him. John raises him. But when he is raised from the dead or from fainting, whatever it is, then his wife wakes up and sees that he has fainted. And so she is upset that he's dead. So there's like this sort of like a Romeo and Juliet story where they see each other dead. And so they both want to disappear. But John is concerned that the townspeople are going to be upset for having both of them die. So he raises both of them. And then the people are all amazed at his great miracle. So he stays with them for a while. And in their home, it became a place for old widows of the town. So now some of the town officials are accusing John of trickery because he's healed so many people. And so all these widows that have come to town are also ill, and he heals all of them. And so with all the townspeople coming, this is his opportunity to lecture. And he lectures them on morality and asceticism, which are two of John's major themes. Now, you might be asking, was the story written so that we could have a little lesson on morality and asceticism? Or was it a story about healing and then we just throw in the teaching part too? We don't know. But anyway, they're both in part of the story. And then there's one that you might recognize where John leads his followers to the temple of Artemis, who is the same as Diana. And you probably recognize the Roman Diana from the Acts of, from Paul. where Paul had stirred up huge crowds. And then John is stirring up the crowd because he comes on a festival day and he's wearing black when everybody else is wearing white. And so that's a big offense because it's a festival day and it causes a near riot. So John confronts them and says, remember all of my miracles, don't get upset with me now. And they're still kind of wound up. So he proposes a test. They should pray to Artemis and that, and if they succeed, they're going to pray to Artemis that he should die, and he's going to pray to his God that all of them would die. So, threatened with the possibility of death, the people agree that John's God would be greater. They decide not to go through with the test. And so while John is praying for them, they can see that they've been deceived. And because right then, the altar of Artemis splits in two. And the half of the temple collapses, killing the priest of Artemis. And now this is causing a lot of the Ephesians to convert. So again, a lot of the story has to do with converting to John's God. Okay, one more story about John. It's too fun. Oh, I'm running out of time. It's about bed bugs. I'll just tell you really fast that when John was traveling, he went to a hotel room, kind of like there were bed bugs. He told the bed bugs to go wait outside so he could sleep well. And he woke up in the morning and the bed bugs were still out there. When he left the hotel, he told the bed bugs they could go back in the bed again. So, okay, those are my 3 stories about John and the Acts of John and the letter of Peter to Philip and Judas. We've got just a few minutes left, but let's just hear some comments or questions about these before we hang up the night. Any thoughts or questions about these 3? If you didn't, if I had to go through the stories too fast, you can find them on Early Christian Text website. Okay, go ahead, Maureen, let's hear you.
I will just confess my ignorance or whatever, but what are we supposed to take from this awareness that if it's all a bunch of made up stories, I feel like I'm standing on shifting sand.
Yeah,
where
okay.
I thought it was a rock and now it's sand. So what do I do?
I'm really glad for you to raise this question because one of the reasons I wanted to show these to you is that we're not looking for history, but we're looking for the meaning of what they're talking about. So John, the Acts of John, he's trying to talk about having faith in his God, and that his God was more powerful than the other gods. And the letter of Peter to Philip, they're talking about learning how to actually go become disciples and heal, as opposed to becoming great characters. And Judas is talking about discovering that Jesus was teaching about immortal life, not about sacrifice. So these are very important, different kinds of messages. Okay, 3 hands in a row here. Let's go. Toto, what about you? Yeah, he disappeared.
Hi. Right. I was going to say, I really appreciate that you guys even brought up like Gone with the Wind, and mythology like the Odyssey and the Iliad, or Iliad and Odyssey, because they are not factual doesn't mean they're not true in a sense. And I think a lot of things that are knee-jerk reactions sometimes to go, whoa, hold on, this changes everything. If it's not historically accurate, it really doesn't. It doesn't have to. There's so much that we gain from parables and mythology that, and Gone with the Wind, or a movie that just, shifts our whole perception. So we can still, I think God still speaks to us in whatever form, whether it's historical accuracy or a children's book or whatever, or a song. So I appreciate, especially the Gone with the Wind. That was such a great example.
That's just great. Thank you so much. Joy?
Well, okay.
Yeah, good.
I just think that this is really important because we all have had times when someone that's so important to us in our lives passes on. And we do need to, we are looking for, what do I do now that this leader has gone? What am I supposed to do? And so I don't care about the historical right of it. It's that these books are talking about what people did when that leader left the earthly scene. And so I think that's really important, and I hope to have some time to really read these books.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joy. I appreciate your sharing that too. And Honor, you might be the last one here with your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, it seemed to me that in those 3 books that you just talked about, that we never heard of before, that a number of the things, of the incidents that were mentioned, were kind of replays of the things we're familiar with in the canonical Gospels. I mean, the one with John and having somebody come to my house because my wife is dying, that's just a replay of Jesus and Jairus. Yeah. So what occurs to me is, I read someone once who said that she wouldn't care if you could actually prove that Jesus had never lived, because she had, on the basis of what we have read about him, she had been able to carry out and live what he taught and have an effect in her life that way. So we're almost, from what we're hearing tonight, we can almost come to the point that that's close to the case. Jesus surely must have lived, because so much has come from the point in history where he is said to have lived. That may be the only thing that's for sure. And then we can build on that from what we are told that he taught and did and expected of us, and find that it's valid. The Iliad and the Odyssey were mentioned, and I think that was, before Christianity came, that was probably the Greeks' Bible, and they lived in accord with that code of honor and whatever. So as Toto said, there maybe is not a lot of need for tacking it down to a specific human person. And maybe it's better for us to grow out of that and just take it and run with what we see that's right and illustrated by the stories, whoever wrote them about whomever.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm really, we're going over a little bit, but I think what we're concluding with tonight is so helpful. I really appreciate all what you're saying. And Helen, why don't you go ahead and be the last word?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate what everyone was just saying, is that why do we have to, obviously, we build on what Jesus did, but it's very encouraging that we can build on what Jesus did. We don't know in the Gospel of John whether Jesus went through all those monologues and dialogues that he had in that gospel, but they are so inspired and they're so spiritually satisfying to me. And for us to know that there are communities that continued after Jesus that came up with equally inspired content and shared it with the world, and continues through today for all of us, that it's not something that's located 2,000 years ago that's not relevant to us in a sense that it's what we build on it that's important.
Really well said. Amen to all of you. I so appreciate this. And so I'm just going to resonate with what you've said. I'm so grateful for you. So Hillary, I need to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. This was the March 2023 textual study for the Bible and Beyond discussions titled, What Did Jesus' Disciples Do After He Was Gone?, led by Dr. Shirley Paulson. Once a month on Monday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we provide a discussion on some topic related to early Christian texts. One of our knowledgeable scholars leads these sessions, allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. You might like to know that next month, our topic is the impact of poverty in antiquity. Dr. Ellie Elliott, who is a frequent contributor to our discussions, will be our guest scholar, so don't miss it. That will be April 24. And you probably remember that we rely on your regular donations to be able to produce these textual studies. We want to pause once again to thank those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon. If you haven't become a subscriber yet, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond. PayPal or a check is also an option that we certainly appreciate. Check the website, earlychristiantexts.com. Thank you all so much.
And thank you, Hillary. And thanks all of you for being with us tonight. What a treat.